Well, Adam Creighton, welcome to the NACON Australia podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
Great to have you on. I want to talk to you about a whole lot of different subjects, trade policy, your recent trip to Argentina, and no doubt much more. But you will always be a hero to me and to many of my listeners because of the stance you took during the COVID hysteria. You're one of the few sane voices in the Australian press, at least during that time. Where do you think we are now? Has there been anything like the reckoning for that disastrous public policy period in Australia? Yeah.
Look, I don't think there has been, and there should be, but there probably won't be. And we saw just in the last week, the British government had a big inquiry, some sort of quasi-royal commission or kind of whatever their equivalent is, and it brought down these ridiculous conclusions that said they didn't lock down soon enough or hard enough. And I mean, I have advocated in the Australian context that we have a royal commission, but you do need to understand that if you do that, it may just confirm what the elites want it to confirm. And that's why at first I said we don't need to have a royal commission, don't worry about it. I've more recently written in the Australian we should have one, because if the right people were chosen to lead it, and they had inquiring minds, it would lead to the conclusion that it was the greatest public policy disaster in human history in peacetime, in my view. I mean, I'd go further. I think what we did was so crazy. It's that the year 2020 was a turning point in modern history, just as big in my view as wars or anything else. And it hastened the demise of the West, in my view, because we saw suddenly that we weren't what we thought we were. We weren't. We don't really care about human rights. Basically, we have a very totalitarian system of government when it suits the government. We're all hysterical. We're not rational. We're nasty. We dob people in. We did all the things that we accuse, China of doing and Russia of doing and the so-called baddies doing. We're just as bad. So I think it was a terrible moment for the West. Privately, I think people realised what we did was a disaster, and that includes many of those who cheered on the lockdowns in Australia. I mean, I don't want to mention names, but there are a lot of prominent economists in Australia in 2020 who are still prominent and who attacked me viciously for opposing those measures, the lockdowns, the mandates, all the nonsense. And now they wouldn't support it in public. They just don't talk about it. And so I think you find people just don't like to talk about it anymore and they certainly don't want to be reminded of their tweets and views from 2020 or 2021. And, I mean, personally, I feel extremely vindicated. I mean, I think I look, like in hindsight, I look great. And so do the other handful of people who opposed it too. But we just have to hope that in all the reviews that are done, and there are many being done around the world, and there will be more done as time passes, people will be less hysterical about it and less polarized, less tribal about it, and they will see the facts. And it's pretty clear that those extremely destructive lockdowns didn't make any difference to the spread of the disease or so cases, deaths. There's no statistical relationship. This has been proven numerous times. So it was just all cost and no benefit, and it's very sad that's what that Australia went down that path, and we haven't abrogated it. Like you mentioned Argentina earlier, and Buenos Aires had the second longest lockdown in the world after Melbourne. And it was even more destructive there because it's a much poorer city. Just imagine all the slums and so forth, trying to lock people in there, in their little hovels. I mean, it's just absurd. But they have realised the folly of that, and the government there admits it was a terrible mistake. Here, that's not the case. I think certainly if you ask the Victorian government, they would not admit any error. And I think other governments would be reluctant to criticise what happened.
Mm. I mean, doesn't the restoration of confidence in public administration in Australia require some level of accountability, if not legally, but at least those who were in charge at the time should have their reputation damaged a little bit? I mean, I live in Brisbane, literally within stone's throw of the governor's government house, which was where now the Jeanette Young,
amazing
officer of Queensland, still resides. And she was, amongst many who were bad. but they still are kind of respected in the community, and there's still no questioning of that. And it's almost, I feel like it's almost all these other issues that we discuss and get very passionate about, like net zero and the rest of it. I mean, if you're not gonna honestly address the massive failure in decision making and governance that occurred during that time, well, which have massive financial and other consequences, well, doing, you know?
Look, I think it's because it's just too deeply it's very personal for me. I mean, I think because let's just let's just say 80% of the population fully supported what was going on, or even 70, right? I mean, that's a huge share that supported madness.
Mm,
And I don't think, and let's say half of that 70 now realize it was wrong. They don't want to be reminded of their wrongness. And I think that explains really all that's going on. I mean, we're right to criticize authorities at the time because they
mm,
were weak. But at the end of the day, the political class was responding to a political demand to do crazy things. And I mean, at the time, of course, in my role as economics editor at the time of the Australian, I was speaking to politicians privately, former and current politicians, and many of them, I can remember, I won't name names, but many of them agreed with me privately, would never say so publicly, that they just felt they had no choice but to cheer on madness because that's what the masses wanted. And in a democracy, you've got to do what the masses want. Otherwise, you're finished. So I think we saw, and for me, it was just, kind of, I know a bit of history. I'm sure you do too. The burning of witches in Massachusetts, and the various panics throughout history. And we thought that we'd, passed all of that, and we were more advanced. But that whole episode made me realize we are no more psychologically advanced or mentally advanced than people were hundreds of years ago. Not at all. In fact, in many ways, maybe worse because social media is just ever present way to scare people and and to tribalize them, to coin a word. Um, so yeah, look, I agree with you, but there are very few. I mean, I can't think of a single government report from any government around the world that has stridently condemned what happened. Now, there's a lot of academics that have. There's a lot of academic reports that have, and the data speaks for itself, right? I mean, just look at Sweden in Europe. You've got the nation that was pilloried the most globally. I remember the New York Times headline saying it was a cautionary tale. Well, that so-called cautionary tale ended up having the lowest excess deaths of any country in Europe over that 3-year period, and that is basically indisputable. And whether it was lowest or second lowest or third lowest, who cares? The point is, they did not have to, impose this extraordinary nonsense on their people for, in some cases, 2 years. I mean, on and off. Uh, it was unbelievable what happened, and even more unbelievable to me. You shouldn't have asked me about COVID, Dan, because I can talk about it for
oh,
hours. But but even more weird to me was that you had all these pandemic plans that have been written by very intelligent people, very thoughtfully, based on all the evidence we had over many decades of dealing with contagious diseases. And indeed, Australia's was updated in 2019. We had a pandemic influenza plan. The UK had one in 2018. The US had one. They all basically said the same thing, is that if you have a highly contagious virus, you do not, you try to maintain calm and you do not force people to do things. And indeed, the World Health Organization even had a list of all the measures of things not to do, such as, border closures, airport closures, school closures. Do not do any of these things, it said. Do not force people to work from home. And yet we did all of those things. So why do we do it? Well, if you're a conspiracy theorist, it's because, the elites are very controlling and totalitarian and they want to be like China. I don't have that view. I just think humans are, to be religious, very fallen creatures and get scared very easily and think that they can stop viruses when they can't. I'm afraid. So we just imposed all this cost on ourselves for no reason. And in fact, I would say that, and I'm sure I'm right. And indeed, John Ioannidis at Stanford says, and he's one of the best epidemiologists in the world. We definitely killed more people through those lockdowns than we saved, overwhelmingly.
agree.
And we killed younger people. We killed younger people. We may have saved a few 85-year-olds, maybe, who had 3 years to live at most, but we killed a lot of young people.
Mm. I mean, the one cause for hope has been Jay Bhattacharya, who is this
Yeah,
very well known
wonderful.
stand
I met him a number of times in the US.
great guy. I met him a few times too, but he's appointed now as head of the National Institutes for Health in the United States. Um, but I still feel like, and maybe it will come, but there hasn't yet been the results that we might have hoped for because of that appointment out of the US. And as you know, right, if it happens in the US, it can tend to flow throughout the rest
Yes.
of the kind of Western world. So, have you heard anything further about what might be coming down the tracks from there?
Well, but in terms of the analysis of what we did in COVID, well, I mean, the senior officials in that administration, Marty McCarry and Jay, and of course, Robert F. Kennedy, they are all on the record multiple times in various forums condemning what happened. But I don't think there's going to be a big report that condemns it. I don't think the US really operates like that as much as we do. They don't have the same reverence for the establishment as we do in the UK and Australia, where there's a report and that just settles it. It's far more disputed and so forth. No, look, I've been pretty happy with more broadly what Jay and RFK have been up to. I mean, remember they are they're heading up a bureaucracy of tens of thousands of people who hate them. So largely who hate them, and so there are limits to what you can actually do. But I think the benefit of Jay and RFK being there, and I'm a big fan of RFK, by the way. I know he's a controversial figure, and most Australians think he's crazy because the mainstream media portrays him as crazy here. But I think he's one of the greatest Americans of the last generation, and I'm a huge fan of him. And I think that he's telling the public things that they need to hear. That there are a lot of so-called truths which have not actually been established, and people just believe them because they're told to believe them, but there's actually not a lot of evidence to support them, and that's not surprising to me. Um, so I want to actually write some columns over the summer when it's tends to be quieter about the vaccine wars in the US, which are just fascinating to watch. Really, really interesting. Probably the most interesting thing of the last 5 years, I think, is kind of as a journalist or former journalist, is just going down the rabbit hole a bit on that debate. And wow,
Mm,
it's fascinating.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it has a magical quality, the term vaccine,
Oh
and
yeah, it's a religious word, clearly.
yeah, and as soon as you apply it to a particular type of medicine, it becomes, indisputable, that it can't be questioned. But look, I mean, that is something that you really could talk about for a long, long period of time.
Yes, yes.
Uh, one sort of, you know, segue into sort of more pure economic discussion that I wanted to raise with you is, one of the things that struck me during that COVID debate was that there were people, like you and others, and others, friends of mine, who were focusing on the key data points, key metrics, and they're now very fluent in it. And you refer to Jay Bhattacharya and you Snatcher Gupta and all the sort of different experts and particular data points, which we all know. But it was almost as though I thought large sections of the press didn't know what to look for. It wasn't just that they were following the mob, it was their analytical ability wasn't there either. And I mean, if you're not able to do that in a crunch like the COVID stuff, how much confidence do you have in other areas that they're actually focusing on the right
Well,
way of assessing, say, the economy more broadly?
look, it's a very good point. You're right. I think the analytical ability of most journalists in that first 6 months of 2020 and indeed the rest of the year and through 2021, which was really the peak of the madness, was very, very bad. And I stood out. And I still remember that March April period 2020 quite vividly. It was kind of a weird, kind of eerie time of my life where we had that
Mm,
first 6-week lockdown in Sydney from about the last week of March. And the whole world pretty much did, except for a few cases, but everyone kind of did. There was a lot of uncertainty. And by mid-March, I was very worried about the virus. I was certainly not of the view that I ended up having. I was very worried about it because we didn't really have the data. We didn't know what was going on. But to your point, there was a lot of publicly available numbers and data available by the end of March, by the first week
mhm,
of April, which I was looking at. And then it became very clear to me that the virus was just not that deadly, and it did not justify the hysteria that it was being accorded. And then we had that cruise ship off Japan, wasn't it? The Diamond Princess. Was it Diamond Princess?
Yeah, that's right.
And then that
Control.
data came in, and that data came in, and there was basically a cruise ship of lots of old people, pretty much. And they were stuck on it with this virus for days. So the virus had a very good chance to circulate as much as it possibly could. And then so we got all the death statistics and the illness statistics from from those that 1,500 people or whatever it was, and a few people died. Obviously, that's very sad. But the conclusion that I took from that, and also that John Ioannidis and other very bright statisticians in the UK took from that, was that actually not that deadly, and it's actually okay because you could back out of their demographics the infection fatality rate for the whole population. Making a
Yeah.
few assumptions, and it was very, very low, and it ended up being very, very low. But of course, the media doesn't understand numbers. They don't understand the difference between infection fatality rate and case fatality rate, which is a crucial distinction, right? I mean, not everyone who gets sick presents at a hospital. I mean, it should be
Mm.
obvious, but and so you had phrases like death rate bandied around. No one really knew what that meant. Um, Look, I think just more on journalists in general. I think they are a very pro-establishment disposition because they are part of the establishment now, very different to journalism 50, 60 years ago when most of them had not finished high school or they'd only finished high school. They certainly hadn't gone to uni, and they were paid much worse. They were much more skeptical of authority. They were probably much more left wing politically in an old fashioned economic sense, but they were also a lot more skeptical of authority. And that's completely changed now. Journalists, they've often gone to uni, they've often gone, I did, full confession, but I didn't start out as a journalist. Most of the journalists did start as journalists. They hadn't done anything else before. Um, and they talk to authority and important people all the time and they respect them. Sometimes they want to be part of that. And I think, you see it not just in COVID, but, climate change as well, kind of, kind of economic forecast, anything where there is an establishment separate from the government, the journalists tend to look to that establishment for as the source of truth, the single source of truth, to quote Jacinda Ardern. And that was very disappointing. And yeah, they really had no kind of, I remember journalists demanding of Gladys Berejiklian in 2021 or maybe 2022, and I was in the US at the time, but obviously I followed it closely while I was over there, and basically asking her why she wasn't mandating masks or why she wasn't locking down the state. I mean, like as if that was a reasonable question. So back to my earlier point, politicians were terrified to do the right thing
Mm.
because you'd get journalists saying, "You're killing people, you're gonna kill people," and that is scary for a politician. So, but that just reflects the stupidity of the fourth estate, I would say. So, look, it was a very sad opinion. I mean, I lost a lot of respect for a lot of my peers, some
Mm.
in particular, and a lot of them at the time hated me. I know that. They said I was, I'm a murderer and you're supporting death and all this stuff. People that I had liked said this sort of thing. And it kind of hurt a bit because I honestly didn't think I was. I think I was just trying to be sensible and put things in proportion. Um,
Mm.
but anyway, so I've been nicely vindicated. But the interesting thought experiment is: what if we had another COVID, a similar virus? Not now, not this year, but say in 2030. So, what would we do? What would happen? And that's a very interesting question. And I don't know the answer to that. Some smart people say we'd never do what we did before. But then again, other people say yes, we would, because it's not been abrogated. It's not been thrown off the books as a policy response, especially in Australia. Because I've been writing columns recently about Victoria in particular, and just making a point that no one makes, except me, to my knowledge, is that Victoria has not formally said what it did was wrong. It's not promised not to do it again. So if you're a foreign investor or you're thinking of moving to Australia, you're thinking of building a regional headquarters in Melbourne,
Mm.
at the back of your mind is that you and your family are going to get locked down for 250 days. Um, and you wouldn't move there. You wouldn't invest in Victoria. And so my point is that's a very big negative on Victoria and Australia more generally, is that people are going to be reluctant to invest here or spend money here if they think that their family or themselves are at risk of ridiculous totalitarian policies. And so I think it's in Victoria's interest and Australia's interest to say we will not do that again, and we're very sorry.
Mm. I'm struck, and I'm sure you appreciate it as well. When I was in the States in September, it has permeated the American psyche. The terrible lockdowns in Australia. They talk
Oh,
about still talking about Crocodile Dundee and then the
yep.
lockdown. and this is average people on the street, as
Yeah.
though it's certainly hurt the reputation of Australia
Oh,
generally, I think.
hugely. I mean, so I was in the US, just for your viewers. I was there from March 2021 to, well, to basically early this year. So, 4 years almost. And so the first part of COVID I spent in Australia, but I missed the worst bit. The 2021 bit is when, Victoria went crazy and everything went crazy. I was thankfully out of the country by then.
Mm,
Um, and yeah, and it did get a lot of attention in the US on Fox and mainstream media. Uh, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, which performed extremely admirably throughout, and he deserves extraordinary credit, that man,
mm,
for being so strong on that issue. But he gave a speech likening Australia to communist China. He mentioned Australia, called us out twice.
mm,
He questioned the alliance. This is someone who could be, Republican candidate for president one day, right? Um, so his view of Australia clearly declined massively. But I had
mm.
doormen in New York hotels when I stayed up there. I stayed up there a lot. They'd hear my accent, and one of them ran up to me one day. I always remember. He said, "Are you Australian?" I'm like, "Yes." He said, "Oh, sorry, I couldn't help but overhearing your accent." He said, "What the f are you guys doing down there?" It was just some, you know, ordinary New Yorker, a black guy. Just, he was
Yeah,
very candid and frank with me. And I said, "Look, I'm sorry, I'm very embarrassed about it, but it's crazy." And, so Americans were seeing all this on their phone. As you say, the image they have is still created in the 1980s,
mm,
Dundee or more recently, Steve Irwin, very
yeah,
outdoorsy, people, rugged people, irreverent people. Well, that was shown to be all complete nonsense. And I think
mm,
that's actually part of our social funk now as a country, I would say, is because we realize all that is a fraud. It's a total fraud. We like to still think of ourselves that way, but since 2020, everyone knows it's a fraud. It's actually a lie. It's actually false advertising. It's false advertising. I mean, we market ourselves to the rest of the world still. I mean, I don't know what the campaigns are, but you'll have people on the beach, muscular people on the beach running around, being all outdoorsy. That's all rubbish, complete rubbish. So,
oh,
and I think that's a struggle for us, like as a country. What are we now? I don't know.
yeah.
Frankly,
I
I'm
mean,
not very happy we are,
that
but we certainly are what we thought. We certainly are not what we thought we were.
no, I mean, that comparison to communist China seems overblown to an
Oh yeah,
Australian audience. But I mean, as you probably know, I mean, I spent 13 years in Greater China, Hong Kong, and mainland China.
okay,
And I remember coming back. I had like a bit of a routine where I'd come back to Australia and go to Bondi Beach, getting off the plane and refresh. And isn't it great to live in a free
yes,
society? And so those scenes in March of 2020, where the authorities was, basically reprimanding young people in sunshine, in saline air from their offices in, air-conditioned offices in Canberra, coughing into their jumpers. I mean, that was, Beijing-style sloganeering. I was just like, "This is not," if you translated it in Chinese, that is a different type of political culture to the one that I was used to in Australia. And it kinda it really hit hard because I was looking around going, "This is not," there was no legitimate questioning of authority. Any questioning of authority in the kind of nice, cynical, Mencken journalistic sense was looked
none.
upon
Yeah,
a
there's
as
there's
as a
there's treachery
troublemaking
or
or
yeah.
absolutely. It was not healthy. I mean, do you think that always existed in Australia? Or was it just this thing which prompted that, I don't know, latent authoritarian streak?
Um, Look, it's a very good question. I've been asked this a lot. I probably don't give the same each. I don't give the same answer each time because I don't know the definitive answer. I don't think I know. Why did we behave that way? I mean, well, first point is most Western countries behave stupidly, so it's not like we were a
Mm,
total outlier, but we were definitely more extreme than other countries, I would say. I mean, in the US, California was derided as the extreme lockdown state, and New York. Those two states were the archetypal lockdown states. But when you look at the details in Australia, you realize that their lockdowns were pathetic. Like they weren't like what happened in Victoria and New South Wales. Like you could still travel around, you could still go to the airport and leave the state. Like they weren't really locked down. Um,
mm,
there were no 5 kilometer rings of steel. There were no helicopters on the beach, that sort of thing. I mean, it was a very light version of what we had. And I think it's partly because they all have guns and the police don't. At the end of the day, police don't like to enforce things that's going to put them at
Mm,
risk of being shot. And so it's
yeah.
much harder for US governments to do that sort of thing. Whereas in Australia, you've got a disarmed population. You can basically do whatever you want to them, really. They can't fight back. Um, but why? I don't know. I think we're just a very rich country. We're an island. I think it gives the mentality that as an island, we can keep things out if we want. And there's some truth to that. We're also extremely wealthy, very urbanized, and there's a high correlation with being urbanized and rich, with
Mm,
being kind of very left wing or putting great faith in government. So we have enormous faith in government in Australia as basically doing the right thing. We've never had a government that is like the US government or other governments that have actually done shocking things to their people. We Australia, well, I mean, I would argue it now has, but yeah, the conventional wisdom was that had not happened.
mm.
So you respect the government. So yeah, I think that's why. But yeah, but just gets back to thought, would it happen again? Honestly, I mean, I don't think it would, for the fact that I think most people secretly think what happened was insane now. And I think even the I Stand With Dan crowd, who was still still on Twitter and still supporting their hero, I think deep down the inflation that was caused by the response has damaged their standard of living. They can't afford airfares as easily anymore. They can't go on holidays as much anymore. I think they know what caused all that. It was not, Russia invading Ukraine. That was just nonsense. It was all the money printing that is required if you have lockdowns. So, okay, let's have lockdowns again for 200 days. Well, that's going to be another $300 billion of new money. Your purchasing power is going to fall another 20%. So you're already 20% poorer than you were in 2019. Do you want to be another 20% poorer? And I think most people will not want to be another 20% poorer than they now are. And basically, that's what would happen. I mean, I don't know about you personally, but me, I mean, I think I was the wealthiest, or not the wealthiest, but my purchasing power and my income in 2019, the end of 2019, was much higher than it is now. Because the prices have just gone up so much in every respect. Um, whereas airfares or food or everything, the price of coffee. I mean, when I left Australia, I could get a coffee in King's Cross in Sydney and Potts Point where I live for $3 Australian, and it was good flat white. When I came back, it was $5.50 at the same store.
Wow.
Um, and that's, to me, that's breathtaking inflation. I mean, that's massive, massive, and that's been reflected across everything. And I can tell you, my salary did not go up 100% between 2019 and 2025,
Mhm.
and very few people's did, right? Very, very few. So most people are poorer than they were 5 years ago. And if they were honest with themselves, they'd say, "Yes, I am poorer, and it was because of the COVID response." I mean, what else could it be because of?
Yeah, okay. Well, it's it's a danger talking about COVID because
Yes,
the passion still is there, right, with you and I,
it
as
is. It
with
is. It's,
and it's cathartic to go and talk about this stuff with
it
people who
is.
are
It is.
on the same page. But to change gears slightly, I mean, I did want to talk about trade policy with you a little bit. I mean, you had an article in the Australian, I think about a month ago, where you said, was titled at least, "Why the US and Australia are rethinking free market economics amid China tensions," which seemed to agree that critics of existing free trade ideology had a point. How should Australia change its trade settings, if at all?
Well, look, I don't think I made any recommendations. I don't think I
You
made
didn't.
any
Yeah.
recommendations for Australia because Australia is relatively small and is in the rather invidious position, I guess, at the moment of being wholly dependent on China for our income, basically, but massively
Mhm.
aligned with the US, kind of ideologically and militarily. And the US and China, although the phone call this week maybe suggests that things are okay at the moment between Trump and Xi, but they are rivals, fierce rivals, and Australia is kind of caught in between the two of them. No, I just think I made what I thought, and the column you're referring to was inspired by a paper that came out from Harvard economist Denny Roderick. And if you've studied economics at all, as I have or did for many, many years, you'd be familiar with that name. He's a very famous economist, very conventional trade economist, very respected, and he put he put out a paper about 15 pages, very readable, just basically saying, look, Adam Smith kind of won the battle of ideas, maybe, and he's, free trade and, David Ricardo's ideas, comparative advantage, blah, blah, blah. They're all very they're accorded special status, but the record is really more mercantilist, and it still is. And that's just the reality that the governments behave in a mercantilist manner, and where they haven't, they have lost out in certain ways recently. Like for instance, and this is both Trump and Biden. They're both trying to get chip making in the US desperately in national interest for national interest reasons. And with mixed results, I would say. But Biden passed that big Chips Act thing to try to get high end manufacturing basically away from Taiwan and to the US. I'm not sure it's working, to be honest. But anyway, that's a recognition that just this free market issue where you let manufacturing leave of certain things is not in the long run in the nation's interest. Just remember, free trade assumes there's no such thing as governments, right? I mean, it assumes that everyone just nicely trades with each other and is friendly and blah blah blah. I mean, there's no national competition in free trade theory. It's just everyone's nice, but of course everyone's not nice, and people hate each other, and there are rivalries, geopolitical rivalries. That's just reality. And the other thing is, it also assumes, I think, that that all countries behave in the same way, and they don't. So China in particular, whether it's critical minerals or the rare earths, there's a lot of chatter about those things in the media. And on that too, Australia and the US recently signed a deal to try to get some processing and mining of those in their countries, because China's got the market all wrapped up. And the only reason it has the market wrapped up is because 30, 40 years ago, it had the foresight to see that these would be useful, or indeed it was lucky, foresight or luck, whatever it was. But they spent a lot of government money making sure, and imposing regulations, making sure that their industry would grow and flourish in rare earths. And it's now given them extraordinary power on the global scale because, as you know, weapons and phones and all sorts of things. I'm certainly not an expert, but a lot of important things need these rare earths in them, and they currently come from China largely. So that's why the US is freaking out. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary it's taken this long for them to realize. I mean, it's not like China's just suddenly appeared. So, and of course, COVID showed too that there are some things, critical things, that governments want to have domestically, whether it's pharmaceutical manufacturing or whatever, that in a crisis you realize, and this is particularly true for Australia, which is so far away from everywhere, that if your shipping lanes get cut or whatever, you need to be able to do things yourself. So I think there's been a reevaluation of it. And I'm not saying, the IPA is still very pro free trade, and, in general, so am I, but not as obsessively as I might once have been.
But there's one thing about accepting that the critics might have a point, and I'm sure. I mean, I there's been a lot of thoughtful discussion in the US, which you sort of touched on in that piece. People like Oren Cass from
Yes.
American the Heritage Foundation, which is the US's biggest center right think tank, kind of the equivalent of the IPA,
Broadly,
has
yeah.
undergone a significant intellectual change in the last 3 years, where they are now, critical of free trade. They're, amongst other things. I mean, and I don't feel that's happened yet in the political
No,
class in Australia. We
no.
still proceeding as though it's 2000 or 1990, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think general point there, there's huge intellectual debate on the right in the US at the moment. It's fascinating to watch. I enjoy watching it. You kind of just got to get the popcorn. And that's where all the action is intellectually, not on the left at all. It's quite sterile, I would say, on the left in the US. I mean, so it's fascinating. And yes, I would agree with you. Coming back to Australia, obviously it's a much smaller country, right, with a much smaller media and intellectual class. So you can't be too critical. But certainly there's very little debate on the right, I would say, about things. We are still, as you'd say, I still pretty much where, George Bush 2005 kind of thing, that's broadly the right in Australia. Um, and because I spent 4 years in the US, and, I just want to stress here that I'm talking kind of in my personal capacity, not
Yeah.
on behalf of the PA. And, I changed a lot personally in the US over that 4 years intellectually, because I was in that kind of in the middle of that debate, whether it's on trade or foreign policy or, tax and, I mean, all those things. There is a big realignment, right? I mean, I interviewed Steve Bannon and met him a few times. And of course, in Australia, the media portrays him as this evil bogeyman, horrible. Blah, blah, blah. Well, he's actually brilliant, a complete genius, incredibly successful. But aside from that, he shows or reminded me when I went to his terrace in DC for like a 1 hour chat about everything. And, I can tell you he spoke 90% of the time.
Yeah.
That, he is the representative of a strand of the right in the US that he's got really very little in common whatsoever with the Australian kind of right wing. I mean, he wanted to lift the top marginal rate of income tax, lift it, right, in the
Mm,
US.
mm,
And he wanted to I still remember he said he thought, I don't know if he was joking, but it didn't seem to be, that he thought the US should nationalize at least one of the pharmaceutical companies. Just thought was, okay, that's pretty out there. Um, and and so he, he's influential and he reflects the MAGA, the base, as we might say in Australia, which is much younger and much more enthusiastic about Trump.
mm,
They feel a bit let down recently over a few things. Um, but Trump is, he sits at the top of this extraordinary complex beast of vastly different views on immigration, tax, foreign policy, Israel, anti-Israel, whatever. And it's, I don't envy being Trump because he's got to try to satisfy them all, and he can't, obviously.
mm,
And so yes, but Australia, I think, Andrew Hastie came out and made those comments about, it'd be nice to make something. And I must say, I was shocked with that's kind of what inspired my column actually, which came a couple of weeks later. I like Andrew, and it kind of shocked me a bit that he was attacked so viciously over what I thought was a pretty innocuous statement, really. I mean, he basically just said, wouldn't it be nice if we still made things? He wasn't seriously suggesting we bring the car industry back. We can't anyway, right? It's too late. But I think his general point is that people have pride, like there are things other than just dollars and cents.
mm.
Um, and I think the ability to make things, I can't remember who I was talking to yesterday, but I grew up in a car mad household, and, the Falcon Commodore rivalry, kind of all based around Bathurst race was big when I was 8, 9, 10, in the 80s, early 90s. And, we used to watch it with Dad and stuff, and these were Australian cars and something exciting. And then we had Falcons and Commodores ourselves. And, we don't have any of that anymore. We just have these, crap Chinese things, basically. I shouldn't say that, but you know what I mean? It's just, they're imported. We can't make anything. Australians can't make anything. And that doesn't really make me very, very proud. It'd be nice to make something, I mean, I in my column last week, I said that, even Argentina built our nuclear reactor at Lucas Heights. We can't even make that, right? We need a very poor country to build us a nuclear reactor. I mean, that's kind of embarrassing, don't you think? Do you agree with me? I just think, can we actually do anything?
Well, his Hastie's line was, "We need to be more than simply a nation of flat white maggots," and I always think that, which is a great one. But we, as you would know, right? Even by comparable um, standard, our peers, our manufacturing base is incredibly low. I mean, it's
The
5% of the
smallest.
economy,
Yeah, it's
or
smallest in
less.
the OECD. It's the
Yeah,
smallest.
and if we lose the smelting industry, which we would do if there weren't these massive government bailouts, it would fall to, like, back of the envelope calculation, something like 3%. I mean, that's below sub-Saharan levels of sort of economic complexity. And I feel like on the what I call the Howard era legacy right, and I like a lot of those guys and the rest of it, but they still in their mind think it's 1990.
They do.
Um,
I agree with
and
agree with
and
that.
they and they don't think it's a legitimate position. I mean, John Howard, for example, called tariffs stupidity and not conservative. Well,
Yeah, well, can we talk a bit about tariffs a bit? Because so I kind of earlier this year, I wrote a few columns about tariffs in the
mm,
Australian, obviously hooked to what was going on with Trump, et cetera.
mm,
And, I'm not pro tariff, obviously, but I just made the point that I think shocked a lot of people,
mm,
because people get very, well, we talked about the word vaccine. Well, the
mm.
word tariff has a similar,
Ah,
if opposite, kind of magical kind of force where
yeah, yeah.
people go, "Oh my god, it's a tariff." Um, well, it's just a tax, right? I mean, that's what it is. It's a tax. It's a, French word originally, and it's just a particular type of tax, but it's a tax like income tax or GST or whatever, or payroll tax.
Mm,
And all taxes are bad, in my view. It's a relative. Some are worse than others, and
mm,
we can discuss about, which ones are worse. But, a tariff, in my view, is no worse than income tax. So, I mean, in fact, I'd probably say it's better. I mean, that, people would, I'd rather have tariffs than have a, I'd rather Australia have a 10% universal tariff,
mm.
and use all the revenue to cut all the marginal income tax rates,
Yep.
right? That, I mean, to me, far better, vastly better.
Mm,
I mean, It's basically a tariff functions like a quasi consumption tax a bit. Obviously it's not on domestic things, but of course it's going to lift prices.
Mm.
But I'd rather that than be taxed at 42% or 47 cents in the dollar, which is what the current situation is. An obscene situation. Um, and so I just made the point in the US context. Look, I mean, they have a big deficit. They have to raise money somehow, and the president himself can't do many things without Congress agreeing. But the one thing he can do is levy tariffs, and they did, and they raised a lot of money. I haven't seen the latest figures, but I think in the US, $300 billion a year or some huge amount of money. That's a significant. That's a significant, sum that goes some way to closing the gap,
Mm.
which they have to do. So, just if you don't like tariffs, think of things to cut in terms of government spending. Give us,
A-
find $1
And
trillion of things to cut.
they, they do incentivize domestic production, because if you establish something behind the tariff wall, then you avoid the tariff. So I feel like that point is lost in Australian discussion too. Yes, I don't like taxes either, right? But it's an imperfect world, and we'll always have to decide which
Absolutely.
tax to impose, right? But at the moment, we have an agreement with China, supported on a bipartisan basis, that allows 100% of Chinese manufactured goods to come into Australia duty free. I just think that's irresponsible, and you'll never have any sort of serious manufacturing in Australia as long as that is allowed to continue. What do you think?
Look, that's probably true. I mean, I think, like I say, I mean, maybe I should write a column on this, be more explicit and shock everyone. But I'd
Yeah.
rather have a universal flat tariff, and could we just have lower income tax or something than the current situation. I'm less. I mean, it does in theory stimulate local production. It does. It must. Like logically, it must. I mean, I don't know whether we have the scale in Australia anymore to. I mean, I just don't know what would happen, right? You just don't know
Mm,
whether we would develop. I mean, cars, I don't think are ever coming back, sadly.
mm,
I like the fact that we made cars. I thought it was very good. It was good for Victoria. In fact, one point I've made, I can't remember if I made a column or not, but the coalition obviously ended the car sector by turning off the support for it. And at the time, I was stridently in favour of that in the Australian, by the way. Back 10 years ago, or maybe a bit more. Uh, but thinking more deeply about consequences of that, all of those sacked workers. Uh, well, sorry, 2 points. It obviously wounded the union that was largely responsible for cars, and I don't know which union it was. Was it AWU or maybe it was another one? Anyway, the point is, it was the more reasonable of the unions in Australia. It
mm,
was it was the union that actually needed a flourishing private sector to some
mm,
extent, right? And you just destroyed that union. So now the only unions left are the ones that couldn't give two hoots about the cost of electricity, couldn't give two hoots about the private sector. CFMEU gets all its money from the government, basically. Civil construction, the higher ed, and the bureaucracy unions, they don't care about the economy. Couldn't care less. These are extreme left wing. So basically, what I'm saying is we destroyed the one union that that was a counterweight to the other crazy unions. And look what's happened to Victoria. Look what's happened.
mm,
Right? I mean, so all the people that were sacked, some of them would have got jobs. A lot of them would have gone on government support, which obviously makes them instantly left wing voters instantly. Whereas
mm,
privately, so when they were working on the plant, they may have voted Conservative, may have, but they certainly don't now. so so I'm just trying to. So the political consequences of what's happened, I think, been quite disastrous, because you've destroyed the manufacturing sector. Well, the manufacturing sector in Victoria has been destroyed, as far
mm,
as I know, and that used to be what it was good at. Right? It had cheap energy, cheap brown coal. Still using cheap brown coal, actually, as far as I know, isn't it? I'm pretty sure it is. Um, but basically has no serious industry. It's an embarrassment, right?
mm,
It is an embarrassment. So we could have manufacturing again, because we could have extremely cheap energy if we ever just said, bugger it, we're just going to use brown coal for everything. But that's just not going
mm.
to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, the people like Menzies and Alfred Deakin and that would have also thought and deliberately planned policy so that we weren't just going to be a primary producer to an industrial power like Britain, or in today's day, Beijing. And they would have thought it
Yes.
insane to have a policy. And Menzies imposed tariffs on Britain. He would have thought imposing a free trade with China would insane.
Gee, that's
But
interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, no, I used to have fun in the Australian because, it's all, I used to have fun when I'd point out Menzies did and supported certain things that they would find horrifying today. I remember I wrote a column, I don't think I could do it anymore, about income tax. I said, "We should tax people like Menzies did."
uh,
And then he had a top rate of 78% or something.
but in a very high
It
level,
was a
as you
very
know.
different era. Well,
Yeah. I mean, as you know, even though they had a very high top rate, there was, um, average weekly earnings, the income tax rates are now, like, hidden at a much lower level, so it's not,
yes,
uh
yes, that's right. That's right. And that's how I think it should be basically. But anyway, that's another
yeah,
topic.
it's just another. So you just come back from Argentina, and that's sometimes held out as an alternative model to following, um, Trump's America in the Australian press. I think Alexander Dana was pushing that line in a column because it is much more of the kind of classical, I don't know, Thatcherite, libertarian. How's
Yeah.
it all going down there?
Look, it's absolutely fascinating. So I assume your listeners know all about Milei. He's been president for 2 years. He came from nowhere, free market economist, very eccentric chap. He became president of a country that was in, various that's had various episodes of hyperinflation, has massively fallen down the global league table in terms of wealth, uh, crisis after crisis, huge inflation. So he won in 2023. Um, and he's had some great successes so far. He's reduced inflation from about 300% to about 25% a year. Still very high, obviously, by Australian standards, but it's going in the right direction. He's produced fiscal surpluses for the first time in many, many years. He's slashed federal spending by an extraordinary 30% in 3 months when he came into office, which, believe me, that's never happened in world history, as far as I know, anywhere. Well, at least in modern times, right? That's a lot. So in the Australian context, that's like reducing government spending by $250 billion in 3 months, right? I mean, just imagine that's the federal government. So he did all these things, and in the first part of 2024, there was a lot of instability, but these policies appear to be bearing fruit. Like I said, inflation's coming down. The economy is growing at 5% this year. It's forecast to grow 5% next year. They are good figures. And remember, this is real growth. There's basically no net immigration. So 5% GDP growth is 5% per capita growth. So this is very good. There was a midterm elections for the Congress just a few weeks ago. His party surprisingly did extremely well. There was a lot of concern that they wouldn't. And this is why it's so interesting, because now finally his party can legislate. They haven't been able to legislate. So I think one big shock to me, just coming from outside, was thinking Millet's changed everything. Well, no, he hasn't. He hasn't been able to do very much because the Congress has not been in his hands, and it's an American system. Congress is very powerful, just like it is in America. They control purse strings, they control the laws. So Millet's not been able to pass any laws. So he's been able to rule by decree in certain areas that he's been allowed to, or basically given the right to, uh, kind of according to the complexities of the Argentinian constitution. But at the end of the day, the Congress has been trying, especially in the lead up to the election, to make life as difficult for him as possible and to reverse all the things that he'd put in place by reversing his decrees, etc. Because of the good result, they can't do that anymore. And in
Mm,
fact, not only can they not reverse his decrees anymore, but because he got 42% of the vote, and there's a few other little right wing parties, they now have a majority in the lower house,
mm,
which is an extraordinary change from having about 10% of the seats. And in the Senate, they don't have a majority, but they almost have a majority. And so the reality is now the president will be able to send legislation to Congress, which has a good chance of passing. So this is extremely exciting
mm,
because it means that this libertarian revolution can continue in an accelerated way, assuming Millet doesn't have a change of heart. And that's exciting and I guess daunting for,
mm,
I guess, everyone, um, because they still have the most absurd regulations and absurd industrial relations system. I mean, you know, 50% of the workforce is not even employed formally. Like, that's breathtaking, right? So 50% of all workers in Argentina are not even on the books, right?
mm,
There's no taxation collected from them, not a cent. It's all cash. And the reason is they have this ridiculous law. Well, they have ridiculous industrial relations laws, but it's so generous to workers that no business wants to hire anyone, because if you hire someone, there's no probation. First day, if you sack them, they need severance pay. So that's a huge disincentive to hire anyone. And in fact, I was talking to some businessmen over there who just had enough of it. and got out of business because they said they had this food distribution company in Buenos Aires and they caught staff stealing. They were just giving me an illustration of the law. They caught staff on camera stealing for months and quite large sums, basically. They confronted the staff. The staff agreed they were stealing, but because the boss didn't follow the letter of the law in terms of warning them, he had to not only pay them full severance, but give them a 50% bonus for for not for not basically sacking them in the right way. So,
Yeah.
I mean, just crazy. And he said, that's it. I'm out after that. You steal and you get extra payments. That's completely crazy. So
What
anyway, they want to
what
change the industrial.
Yeah, I mean, it's our future, I think that's what Australia's heading, but I was interested, why did they need then if it's going so well, why do they need that big US bailout? Uh,
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. So yes, that's been cast in the press as Millet's being bailed out, and I guess to some extent, kind of has, technically speaking. But I think the more interesting point is why it was necessary, and it was necessary because people thought he was going to lose. And so in the few months before, I think it was October 27 was the midterm election. So in the month or two leading up to that, there was great concern because the polling for his party was not great. Uh, and there was a fear that he'd lose, that his party would do really badly, and that would be the end of the Millet experiment, effectively. I mean, he's got 2 years left of his presidency, but he wouldn't have been able to legislate. And so there was a fear the country would go back to its, to its perilous predecessors in practice, and that's why the peso was going crazy and extremely volatile and was falling and needed to be shored up. So the volatility was because of fear he would lose, not because of his mismanagement. So the one thing annoys me that left wing media is always, oh look, he was bailed out. Millet was bailed out, but he was bailed out because people were worried he'd lose, and so I think it's unfair to say that's his fault, right?
mm,
Do you think? Do you agree? I mean, it's
yeah, no, I mean, I don't follow as closely as you have when you're on the ground there, but I do. I mean, I'm curious about how that experiment turns out. I think Argentina is been there once.
look,
It's incredible. It's an incredible place, but it also has some deep sort of cultural and other
oh,
issues. I'm not sure a president can necessarily solve, no
I think
matter
that's
how
right.
freedom loving. Yeah.
I think that's right, and I think I think an important message, and I've obviously been, beating the drum for him and very
Mm.
enthusiastic, as I think he deserves, but the reality is he needs another term. He needs 8 years to even have a serious attempt at this
Yeah.
because, as you say, the forces against him and the cultural attitudes are deeply ingrained, and I was talking to some senior business people, and they very skeptical that's
Mm.
gonna work, right?
Interesting.
Um because Argentina is just Argentina. It's just not gonna work. He
Yeah.
they love Pelé, blah, 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 and indeed a few other meetings I had, I won't obviously tell you they were, but I had a lot of meetings while I was there, but some people support him. These are very intelligent kind of, former, diplomats and all sorts of things. They support him, but they all said to me in private, they said, "But what next? What happens if, he's assassinated or dies or whatever?" Like,
Yeah.
there's no it just goes straight back to the way it was.
Yeah.
So, I mean, basically, and that's what they're all waiting in the wings for that, I think, for something to happen to him. Like, I mean, I don't
Mhm.
necessarily mean assassinate, I just mean something you leave or whatever. Because, the Peronist forces are vicious and very influential, and they want their power back. Christina Kirchner, who's under house arrest, she's still popular, amongst them, even though she was a terrible president. Her husband was terrible, and they did awful things, but there's a lot of popularity for crazy policies, sadly.
Yeah. A final couple of questions because I know that we're almost out of time. I believe you were once a champion for Big Australia. Have your
Yeah,
views
some people have been calling me out on this recently, which
have
fair
you have
enough.
you have your views changed, and if so, why?
Well, I was. I mean, I was always, look, I just always, I guess, kind of naively, there was a bit of a debate about Big Australia 10, 15, 10, 12 years ago. And I wrote columns about it in The Australian. And certainly it's still the Australians' view that they want, well, at least I think it is. Anyway, things are changing a bit as we on the right, as we discussed before. But, I was very much of the view that I'd like Australia to have a much bigger population because I thought that would make Australia more powerful. And give young Australians more opportunities and make us more dynamic and interesting. So I guess that was kind of a nationalist perspective that I had, or at least. But then again, but this is 10 years ago, and but then now I see that a lot of the a lot of the immigration is not is not culturally the same to as kind of native born Australians, me and others, and it's just turning the country into tribes, basically. That's what I fear. Like, and I think it's very destructive, actually. Um, and I think a lot of it is just based on rorts. Like, so much of it's funneled through the higher education system, and it's all just selling visas, basically. And that's gross to me. It's immoral. It's not honest. Everyone's just trying to clip the ticket in some way to come to this what is beautiful country. The weather's beautiful. We certainly didn't do anything for about the weather. That's just the way it is, right? I mean, so we don't deserve that, right? But where there's people here, and I just think there's just so much ticket clipping, and I think there's less and less sense of any sort of a national cohesion in Australia.
Mm,
Partly stemming from the embarrassing COVID response, I would say. We discussed earlier, like, who the hell are we? What sort of country are we? We don't know anymore because it was so embarrassing.
mm,
We've been in economic decline, clearly, for 3-4 years, I'd say
mm,
serious. And at the same time as that's happened, you have had this huge increase in immigration. And I know some people at the Australian Institute say, "Oh, well, if we hadn't have had the COVID thing and you just extrapolate the line, we're actually, about where we would have been anyway." Well, firstly, I don't know whether the previous rate was right anymore. I think it was still 250,000 a year net overseas migration, which is basically the highest in the Western world. Like, it's crazy numbers. Most countries would think that was crazy, right? That amount. Any European country would say it's crazy. Certainly, the US doesn't have any immigration like that. The only country that comes near us is Canada. Um, anyway, so since then, as you know, it's now 350,000 roughly. Uh, that's huge, and well over more than half is from non-European, kind of non-Christian backgrounds. And my personal view is, I like diversity. Migration's been great for Australia. Australians are extraordinarily tolerant, as you can see. I mean, there's really very little pushback against this. Just look at Europe. Look at the contrast in Europe. You see a lot more anger and public protest in Europe. But that said, I don't think, um, you know, but I don't think having a country in 2050 that's just three large racial groups is going to be is wise. Because isn't it human nature? Maybe I'm just too old-fashioned and conservative, but I think it's human nature to have political parties based on ethnic groups. I think that's true in every country of the world, basically, and that would happen here too. And I don't think that's going to make us a stronger country, and that's why a lot of Asian countries, for instance, don't tolerate high immigration. I mean, I know the Japanese government's a good one. I mean, they'd prefer to shrink than have high immigration. That's policy. We would rather die than have mass immigration. It's basically the view of Japan. And so is that racist? Is Japan racist? I don't know. I'm not going to say they're racist. They have a different view of how their society should run.
Well, I think
I certainly wouldn't say,
it's a different conception of the nation state. The
yeah,
tendency in Australia in the last, I don't know, 30 plus years has been that we're a nation of liberal axioms, whereas Japan thinks of itself as a nation of a people and it can be tolerant and all this and the other, but that's who they are. And I think that older, thoughtful, doesn't need to be an angry or, have any animus towards anyone else. Conception of a nation has kind of been lost here. Maybe
yeah.
it will return.
Well,
Final question.
yeah.
That's certainly happening in Europe and elsewhere. Let's sort of rethinking. I know it's not precisely your beat, but how do you think this plays out politically over the next couple of years? Because record lows for the centre right politically in Australia, but overseas you've had this Trump revolution, remaking of the Republican Party. You've got Nigel Farage's party in the UK
Yeah.
leading. I mean, it's never going to be the same in Australia entirely, for we're a different country with different background. But I mean, can we just be completely insulated against those types of
No, I don't. I
trends?
think so. I mean, obviously, no. It's a really good question, and yeah, you've seen a lot more political volatility in the UK and the US and France and all those other Western countries. That's true, and it's been a bit of a puzzle to me that we haven't seen the same level, the same degree here. It's, I guess, compulsory voting just is a natural force that tends to moderate political debate in Australia, drives everyone to the median, drives everyone to the person who doesn't care or understand, and that's why we just, so many debates in Australia are so banal and sloganeering is because of compulsory voting. I think that's that's just a logical fact. But that said, I think we just don't have. I think Australia, with the right political leadership, if there was a new leader come on the scene, left or right, and it's probably going to be on the right, I would say, because the left these days tends to be the establishment, and it represents, the wealth and moneyed interests, I would say, and just not changing things too much, just doing superficial, nonsense. So it's probably going to come on the right, just like Trump did, just like Farage did, just like the new leaders in Germany and France have. They've all come from the right. Someone very talented will blow apart, in my view, Australian politics. But
Yeah.
with great respect to my friends in Parliament, and I have many of them, uh, we don't have any kind of historic figures yet at all. No one with the combination of courage and skill to just destroy the old parties, basically. Um,
Mm.
and I don't know whether that would be a good or a bad thing, by the way. It could be some sort of, demagoguery. But I just think that that hasn't happened. We don't have a Trump figure. We don't have a Farage figure. We don't have, you know, uh, we just don't have charismatic people. And,
Mm.
but I think it's ripe though for big change. I mean, you just look at house prices. I mean, it's so depressing. I mean, I'm sure you've got, friends in their early 20s and stuff. And, what do you say to people that age, like who aren't going to inherit much money, which frankly is most people. Like there's this idea, I think, readers of the Australian that everyone inherits like, $2 million. No, it's not. I'm afraid that's not. Maybe everyone that reads the Australian inherits $2 million, but most
Uh,
people, most people inherit bugger all, right? And so if they're earning $100,000 a year, which is a good salary for a young person in their mid-20s or late 20s, very good salary, they've got no hope of buying anything. I mean, that's kind of depressing, isn't it? And that's,
I
to me,
don't
my point.
I
My
I
point is
don't
that's for political, turmoil.
Yeah, I just that line that they use, and I'm sure you use we're familiar with in the US. Do you know what time it is? That's sort of one of the slogans of the Trump era. Do you know? And I just don't think people quite on the establishment center right in Australia quite get the urgency or the need to kind of move heaven and earth. It's
Yeah,
more of
it's a
a
tinder. I just
let's
think it's a
let's
tinderbox,
move
really.
back to something more sensible. No, no, no. There needs to be a sort of a certain radicalism because the current
Yes.
situation
Oh,
is
yes. Yeah.
diabolical. Yeah.
No, I agree with that. No, we need more radicalism, but whether that leads to good or bad, I don't know. It depends on what sort of radicalism it is.
I agree. I agree. Hey, Adam, I really appreciate you making time to have a chat. You're one of the
I
main
enjoyed it.
reasons I occasionally tune in and read the Australian. Read it less than I
Thank you.
did these days, but I always appreciate your commentary and your Twitter handle. I'll drop all your contact details in the show notes, and look forward to keeping in touch. Take it easy.
Very much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Dan.
Cheers, mate. Bye.
Great.